The air in the subterranean research lab was thick, a sterile hum fighting the natural damp chill of the Appalachian bedrock. Above ground, the spring night of 1943 was a black, moonless canvas draped over the dense forest. Here, at the Fort Blackwood Annex, a facility that officially didn't exist, Elias Vance, 52, was finishing his shift. Elias was a creature of routine, a man rendered nearly invisible by his occupation. His life was measured in clean floors, polished brass, and the quiet satisfaction of order maintained. He knew the annex better than its own security chief. The precise rhythm of the night watch patrol, the faint sulfur smell near the synthetic fuel storage bay, the single loose floor tile in Dr. Steiner's office, a detail he'd deliberately never fixed. Tonight, however, the routine felt taut. A cold, unnerving sense of anticipation had settled over him like a low-pressure front. It began with the mop handle, his famous, or rather infamous, mop handle. It was an anomaly, a 6-foot-long cylinder of high-grade, reinforced aluminum, a material far too expensive for custodial supplies. The staff whispered it was part of his lunacy, his private protest against the cheap wooden tools of the trade. But Elias simply called it the Sentinel. He'd salvaged it from a discarded experimental frame years ago, meticulously balancing and reinforcing it. Tonight, as he ran his thumb over the small, expertly filed notch near the grip, the Sentinel felt heavy, an anchor against an unseen current. The mystery of the week centered on the Steiner formula, the synthetic fuel the annex was developing. A week ago, a small, critical vial of the raw catalyst vanished. Security had been doubled, fingers pointed, but nothing was found. The theft was impossible. The inner lab was sealed by a pressure-activated lock. Only Dr. Steiner and the base commander could open. Yet, the catalyst was gone. Elias pushed his industrial cart through the empty main corridor. He paused by the massive, reinforced steel door to the main fuel processing room. He'd just finished mopping when he heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist miles from any major road. The distinct, low rumble of heavy internal combustion engines, and not American ones. The rhythmic, deep growl had a specific, guttural tone Elias knew from long-ago newsreels. Panzers. Panic was a thin, cold thread, but the ingrained discipline of decades kept his hands steady. He looked down the empty corridor, the silence suddenly a deceptive blanket. The rumbling grew, now accompanied by the metallic squeal of tracks on gravel. They were outside the main gate, a mile away, but moving fast. Elias rushed to the janitor's closet and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal, not for writing, but a pre-war German language map of the annex's ventilation shafts, smuggled to him by a contact whose existence was as secret as the annex itself. The rumbling was an attack, but the mystery of the stolen catalyst was the real key. Why attack when you could sabotage from within? Unless the saboteurs were already inside. A sudden, violent crack split the night, followed by the distant but unmistakable sound of an explosion. The perimeter fence was breached. The power flickered, plunging the corridor into a flickering emergency glow. The metallic squeal was much closer now. They were on the main access road. Elias gripped the mop handle of the Sentinel, no longer a tool, but a staff. He knew the layout, the weaknesses, the hidden points of access. He also knew one terrifying truth. 3 German Panzer tanks were a deliberate, overwhelming show of force. They weren't just here to steal the Steiner formula. They were here to ensure it could never be made again. He had mere minutes. He needed to warn the Deep Command Center, but the communication lines had gone dead with the first explosion. He needed to fight fire with ingenuity. He sprinted towards the administration wing, his mind racing. The loose floor tile in Steiner's office, the one that had always bothered him. It was a clue, It was the entry point. The catalyst had been passed out through the floor. The saboteur was not a security breach. It was one of the scientists. As he reached the junction, a figure in a dark uniform rounded the corner. A German MP-40 submachine gun raised. The man was a ghost, a trained operative, sleek and silent. Elias stopped dead. "Halt!" the German hissed, his voice an accent-laced gravel. Elias slowly raised his hands. The sentinel held loosely in one. The mop, the joke. "Just the janitor, sir," Elias said calmly, his American accent flat, almost bored. "Didn't hear the warning." The soldier sneered, dropping his guard for a fatal second, convinced by the sight of the mop. That second was all Elias needed. With a terrifying speed that belied his age, he brought the aluminum handle down in a brutal, precise arc, not against the soldier's head, but against the exposed trigger group of the MP-40, shattering the fragile mechanism and sending the weapon flying. The German lunged, but Elias was already moving, pivoting and using the blunt, weighted end of the sentinel to strike a devastating blow to the man's temple. The operative dropped, unconscious, a small, polished silver pin, an eagle insignia, skittering across the clean floor. Elias looked at the insignia, his face grim. Inside and out, the mystery was solved. The attack was the diversion. He checked his watch. Less than 2 minutes since the explosion. The Panzers were minutes from the main loading bay. His path to the command center was blocked by more rumbling. There was no time to run, no time to warn. There was only time to act. He had to stop those tanks. And the only tool he had was a mop handle, a scrap of metal, and the most closely guarded secret of Fort Blackwood, the location of the emergency bypass valve for the volatile, high-pressure synthetic fuel line that ran directly under the access road. He ran, the squeal of the tank tracks vibrating up through his soles. The Sentinel, now the only thing between the Nazis and victory. Did you enjoy this deep dive into the secrets of the home front? The suspense is only building. Don't miss the next chapter where Elias faces the Panzers head-on. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're the first to see how this janitor's unlikely tool becomes the ultimate weapon. The cold, wet air of the steam tunnels hit Elias Vance like a physical shock. The metallic shriek of the Panzer treads now a throbbing bass rhythm just above him. He had descended through the secret maintenance hatch he'd installed himself years ago. A small, recessed panel disguised by a heavy tool chest near the cafeteria kitchen. The steam tunnels, an emergency overflow network for the synthetic fuel lines, ran directly beneath the main access road where the German tanks were advancing. He paused, the stench of old oil and concentrated, unrefined synthetic fuel, a highly volatile compound, burning in his nostrils. He was in the heart of the annex's plumbing, a maze of pipes and valves, each labeled with cryptic, hand-stenciled codes. He needed valve 73 Delta, the emergency bypass for the primary fuel line, the main artery feeding the storage bunkers. Elias's hands, usually steady from years of polishing, were shaking with a controlled intensity. It wasn't fear of the Panzers, it was the profound fear of failing the duty he had secretly taken upon himself. He wasn't just a janitor, he was the self-appointed custodian of a national secret. He remembered the day he acquired the Sentinel. It wasn't crazy at all. A year before the war, a young engineer, a bright but careless man named Dr. Adler, had left a high-grade titanium-aluminum alloy cylinder, part of a discarded engine stress test, in the refuse. Elias, a man who saw the potential in every overlooked thing, rescued it. He had spent his nights filing, reinforcing, and weighting it with salvaged lead shot. It was a perfectly balanced, virtually unbreakable staff. It was his obsession, yes, but one born of a deeply held quiet patriotism and the realization that in a facility focused on the grand science of war, no one ever paid attention to the man sweeping the floor. As he moved, The floor above groaned under immense weight. Clang. Crunch. The tanks were passing directly over him, the vibrations kicking up dust and loose stone. He could practically feel the heat of the engines. 3 of them. 3 Panzer IV Ausf. Gs, by the sound of the tracks and the power of the engines. A massive show of force. The German spies had clearly planned a ground assault to coincide with the internal sabotage. He located the ventilation blueprint he'd pulled from his journal. It wasn't a map of the steam tunnels, but it showed the cross-section of the road and the pipe placement. The main pipe ran about 4 feet below the asphalt. Valve 73 Delta was positioned in a shallow manhole just off the main junction, accessible only from this tunnel. A new noise pierced the air, the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots nearby. German commandos, the Sturmtruppen, were sweeping the external perimeter, securing the facility entrance for the tanks. The main power was still down. His path to 73 Delta was dangerously close to a lateral access ladder leading to the surface. Elias crouched behind a nest of thick, insulated pipes. The air was getting hotter. He pulled a small, specialized tool from his janitor's belt, a modified pipe wrench, perfectly sized for the security nut on valve 73 Delta. This was not a random action. This was the culmination of 2 years of clandestine planning. He had prepared for a scenario exactly like this, quietly studying the flow charts, the pressure tolerances, the weak points. Everyone saw a janitor mopping. No one saw a man memorizing the facility's circulatory system. A shaft of weak, filtered emergency light appeared as a squad of 3 commandos approached the surface ladder opening. Their German was sharp and clipped, their rifles held ready. "Clear the access. Check the drain covers. They may be connected," one ordered in a low, gravelly voice. The closest commando, a massive man with a scar running across his jaw, started descending the ladder. Elias gripped the sentinel, its aluminum body cold and reassuring in his hands. He had 2 choices: fight the squad and risk the noise giving away the whole plan, or use his knowledge of the facility against them. Elias had noticed a minor leak earlier, a tiny pinhole in a steam pressure pipe for the decontamination area, a pipe labeled P14S pressurized steam. Moving with the silence of a man who spent his life observing instead of being observed, he positioned himself near the leak. As the scar-faced German reached the bottom of the ladder, the other 2 watching from above, Elias applied a small, precise pressure with his wrench to a nearby coupling on P14S. The pinhole leak instantly widened. Not a jet, but a sudden, thick cloud of superheated steam erupted, instantly filling the narrow tunnel section. The German on the ladder cried out, a muffled, gurgling sound, as the blinding, scalding fog enveloped him. The other 2 above fired wildly, their bullets sparking harmlessly off the steel pipes, but missing Elias, who was safely hidden behind the massive main fuel line. He didn't wait. He didn't waste a second. The distraction had bought him maybe 30 seconds. 30 seconds of blind chaos and suppressed German shouts. He sprinted through the dense steam toward the junction. He reached the shallow pit. There it was. Valve 73 Delta. The metal was cold, damp. He inserted his specialized wrench. The tanks outside were practically roaring now, the metallic grinding of the treads vibrating his teeth. They were moving into their final assault position, lining up on the storage bay. He braced his feet against the side of the pit, took a deep breath, and began to turn the wrench. The security nut was stiff, refusing to move. He put all his strength, all his years of repressed effort and overlooked work, into the crank. Squeak. Groan. The steel nut finally began to rotate, slow and agonizing, as the roar of the Panzer engines intensified, sounding like 3 hungry beasts just inches above his head. If he failed, if the valve didn't open, the tanks would be inside the annex in less than 60 seconds. The wrench slipped, scraping brutally against the housing of Valve 73 Delta, a sound that felt deafening in the confined space. Elias gritted his teeth, the sweat stinging his eyes. The nut had turned barely a quarter of the way, but already he could hear a faint, high-pitched whine from the primary fuel line, the initial pressure spike. Above him, the Panzer tanks had stopped. The sudden, unnatural silence after the grinding roar was terrifying. They were in position, preparing for the final breach. Elias imagined the scene, the massive 75mm KWK-40 cannons aimed at the thin steel doors of the storage bunker, the one containing the irreplaceable raw material for the Steiner formula. "Damn it! Turn," he muttered, putting his entire weight onto the modified wrench. He felt a deep, wrenching pain in his shoulder, but the nut gave way again, rotating another half-turn. The whine from the pipe was louder, escalating to a thin, panicked scream. The valve was opening. The Steiner formula was not just a fuel. It was designed to be hypercombustible, an explosive power source for advanced aircraft. When contained and mixed, it was revolutionary. When released as raw, pressurized fluid vapor, it was a delayed action bomb. He needed to open the valve just enough to release a significant volume of the raw, highly pressurized liquid into the ground beneath the 3 stationary tanks, without causing an immediate localized explosion that would vaporize him and the annex. It was a precise, terrifying calculation based on pressure, volume, and volatility. A calculation no janitor should have been able to make. Just as the nut completed its second full rotation, a shadow fell over the pit. The scarred German commando, emerging partially from the blinding steam, had located the manhole cover above. He was disoriented and burned, but not defeated. The German let out a cry of rage and stumbled, blindly reaching down with a heavy, sheathed trench knife. Elias had anticipated a confrontation. With his right hand locked onto the wrench, his left hand shot up, the sentinel, the reinforced aluminum mop handle, intercepting the descending knife with a sharp clack. The blade bit into the aluminum, scraping but not penetrating the core. The commando yanked the knife back, his face contorted in a mix of pain and fury. Elias didn't hesitate. He thrust the sentinel upwards, not trying to hit the man, but to leverage the leverage point. The blunt, weighted end caught the lip of the manhole cover, using the force of the strike to slam the thick steel cover down with an ear-splitting boom, shearing the commando's fingers in the gap. A guttural scream was instantly cut off. The manhole was sealed. Elias ignored the sound, the scream abruptly muted by the thick steel. He had to complete the sabotage. He gave the wrench one final sharp turn. Click! The valve was fully open. A forceful, wet hiss erupted from the primary fuel line. Elias looked up. He could see the pipe shivering violently under the immense pressure. The raw, liquid catalyst, a clear, fast-evaporating fluid, was now surging out of the bypass valve, flowing into the earthen substrate directly beneath the 3 Panzer tanks sitting on the road above. He calculated, at this pressure, with the ground saturated beneath the heavy metal-sheathed tanks, the rising vapor cloud would concentrate in the small, hot pocket between the track housings and the chassis. All it needed was a spark. He scrambled out of the valve pit, the roar of the escaping fluid echoing behind him. He looked down at his watch. 4 minutes and 20 seconds since the perimeter breach. He was running out of time. He needed to get clear, and he needed a spark. He fled back toward the maintenance tunnels, the sentinel gripped tight. He was no soldier, but he had just accomplished an impossible feat of engineering sabotage. Now came the impossible act of combat. He ran for the main control junction, the one area where the emergency power lines were still live, running hot wire to the main breaker. It was a 50-yard sprint, and he knew the remaining German ground troops would be swarming the annex main entrance, having heard the noise of the manhole cover. As he burst out of the steam-filled chamber, he was met by a barrage of shouts and flashing muzzle fire. Two Germans, alerted by the commotion, were aiming directly at his silhouette in the flickering emergency light. FZZZT! The bullets whizzed past his head, impacting the concrete wall behind him. Elias didn't fire back. He had no gun. He relied only on a janitor's skill, knowing where to be and when. He threw his body behind a stack of steel barrels marked cleaning solvent, the bullets tearing through the metal. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the one item he always carried, an old, beat-up Zippo lighter, a gift from his father, who had served in the Great War. He needed to get to the main breaker, a high-voltage monstrosity 10 feet away. He had to throw the switch, creating a massive, visible electrical arc, the spark, and then run for his life. The Germans advanced, their silhouettes moving with grim efficiency. "Stop, or we fire again!" Elias didn't answer. He knew his body couldn't outrun a bullet, but he knew his idea could outrun the German tanks. He held the Sentinel in his left hand and the Zippo in his right, ready for a desperate final dash. Elias took a ragged, deep breath behind the shattered steel barrels. The pungent smell of escaping synthetic fuel vapor was already drifting down the corridor, mingling with the scent of hot gunmetal and fear. He knew the volatile cloud was rising rapidly outside, concentrating underneath the Panzers. The fuse was lit. The two German commandos, tense and professional, were closing in, their movements trained and lethal. "Come out! Heraus!" one yelled, his voice echoing with impatience. Elias looked at the main electrical breaker box, 10 feet, a near impossible distance under enemy fire. He didn't have a plan. He had an instinct born of years of observing the predictable nature of human and electrical flow. He pushed off the wall with a surge of adrenaline, not running toward the breaker, but toward the nearest commando. The action was so sudden, so absurdly aggressive, that it momentarily froze the Germans. One of them recovered instantly, spraying a burst of MP-40 fire. Elias used his momentum and the steel staff of the Sentinel in a wild, horizontal sweep. He wasn't aiming to strike a soldier. Crash! The aluminum handle slammed into a stack of empty metal buckets and cleaning supplies on his cart, sending them flying like shrapnel. The sudden, chaotic clatter momentarily distracted the closest German, who flinched and turned his head. In that split-second opening, Elias used his momentum to vault over a low-lying pipe, landing directly by the main breaker box. He didn't look at the Germans. He didn't need to. He focused entirely on the massive, grease-caked lever. The second commando, seeing the janitor by the controls, finally understood the true danger. "Don't touch it! 9!" Elias ignored the desperate shout and the whine of the submachine gun revving up again. He grabbed the main breaker lever, a thick steel handle meant for much larger hands, and heaved it downward with all the force left in his body. KZZZZT. The sound was not just a click. It was a violent, high-voltage scream. A blinding, violet-blue electrical arc jumped from the housing, illuminating the entire corridor in a flash of raw energy. The sudden surge of electricity was the spark, the signal, the fuse. Outside, above the annex, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The raw synthetic fuel vapor, perfectly saturated beneath the hot engine blocks of the 3 stationary Panzer tanks, found the electrical discharge from the now shorted perimeter fence. Whoom! The sound was a single, monstrous concussion that rattled the deep foundation of the entire annex. Elias felt the ground beneath him shudder violently, an earthquake of unnatural force. The lights in the corridor went out completely, plunging everything into a suffocating absolute darkness. But the brief, chaotic glow of the outside disaster had been enough. When the secondary emergency lights, a weak, flickering amber, came back online, Elias was gone. The 2 German commandos were momentarily stunned, their ears ringing, their eyes adjusting to the low light. "He's an agent! Find him!" the first German roared, his face black with soot. The janitor, however, was already back in his domain. He had retreated into the darkness of a massive industrial air conditioning duct, a part of the ventilation system he'd kept meticulously clean, knowing one day it might be his only escape. He pulled the sentinel in after him, the steel mop handle scraping against the tin. He moved silently through the ductwork, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't need to see the result, but he knew with absolute certainty 3 German Panzer tanks, the spearhead of the attack, had been instantly incapacitated, not destroyed by a barrage of shells, but lifted, crippled, and disabled by the precise localized detonation of their own target's volatile fuel. The sheer force of the explosion had blown off tracks, seized engines, and ruptured their fuel lines, turning them into immobilized, burning wreckage in less than 5 minutes. But the mystery remained. The internal spy. The missing catalyst. The operation was crippled, but the threat wasn't fully neutralized. The commando he'd disarmed in Chapter 1 carried that polished silver pin, an eagle insignia. He needed to find the man and discover who had orchestrated the attack from within. He crawled toward Dr. Steiner's office, the location of the loose floor tile. He felt a sudden, profound shift in the tone of the base. The initial panic was gone, replaced by the shouts of confused American security guards, now regaining control. The tide had turned, thanks to the impossible act of a janitor. Elias reached the vent cover above Steiner's office. He carefully twisted the locks. Below him, the office was dark, lit only by the low ambient light filtering from the corridor. He saw a shadow moving. Not a German commando, but a familiar silhouette. Dr. Steiner himself, the inventor of the formula. He was kneeling, his back to the vent, fumbling with the loose floor tile. He had a small rectangular object in his hand. The mystery was finally collapsing in on itself. Elias silently removed the vent cover and slipped out of the duct. The sentinel held high. The soft thud of Elias Vance landing on the carpet behind him caused Dr. Steiner to jump, nearly dropping the heavy rectangular object. The scientist spun around, his face pale and slick with fear, the reflection of the emergency light flashing in his wide eyes. "Elias, what are you—" Steiner began, his voice a frantic, high-pitched squeak. He quickly tried to shield the object behind his back. "The tank attack is over, Doctor," Elias stated, his voice calm, cutting through the panic like cold steel. He gripped the sentinel, its aluminum body now scratched and bearing the mark of the German commando's knife. 3 Panzers disabled. But the real problem is still here. He took a slow step forward. "The catalyst, Doctor, the missing vial, and this." He gestured toward the loose floor tile. Steiner stammered, I was just checking the heating vent. The blast must have—" "The blast was an explosive discharge from your own formula, Doctor." Elias cut him off, his gaze fixed and unwavering. "A blast that only happened because the main line was depressurized from valve 73 Delta. A valve you taught me the location of a month ago. You weren't checking the vent. You were retrieving the transceiver." Elias pointed the sentinel at the doctor's hand. "Show me what you're holding, Doctor." With a trembling sigh, Steiner opened his hand. It wasn't the stolen catalyst vial. It was a compact, highly advanced German-made radio transceiver, the object he had passed out through the floor tile to the initial saboteur, the one Elias had disabled in Chapter 1. It was the communications hub, the link. "It wasn't for greed," Steiner whispered, his facade finally crumbling. His face was a mask of exhausted defeat. "It was for my family. They're still in Vienna. The Gestapo. They offered safe passage. The transceiver was the final confirmation. If the raid succeeded, they would be released. And if it failed? Elias asked, his tone heavy with the weight of betrayal. Steiner looked down, a tear rolling onto his checkered vest. I had to give them the precise location and timing of the raid. I had to let them know the best time to send the tanks to retrieve the formula's raw material. The story of the raid was now complete. Steiner had used his access to steal the catalyst, likely a fake or diluted sample to buy time, passed it out with the transceiver, and the commando team had executed the synchronized attack. The janitor had simply been in the right place, with the right knowledge, at the right time. Where is the real catalyst, Doctor? Steiner's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly clear. It's safe. It's truly safe, Elias. I never trusted them. I hid the true sample in the one place they'd never look. He pointed a shaking finger at Elias's mop cart. In the base of the mop bucket, under the false bottom. You never empty it completely, do you? To keep the scent of the cleaner stable. Elias looked at the mop cart. The false bottom, a small insulated cylinder he himself had installed years ago to keep his personal lunch thermos from smelling like chlorine. It was the only place in the annex where the security chief had never looked. At that moment, the door to the office burst open. 2 American security officers, guns drawn, entered. They saw the scientist, the transceiver, and the janitor with his mop handle. "Janitor Vance, get back! Dr. Steiner, drop the device." Steiner, seeing his chance, made one final desperate move, not toward the door, but toward the window. He hurled the transceiver violently against the thick, shatterproof pane, ensuring no signal could ever be sent. Elias stepped between the guards and the scientist. "Hold your fire. He's contained. He just confessed. The missing catalyst is secured." He walked calmly to the mop cart, reached into the base of the aluminum bucket, and pulled out a small, corked glass vial. Its contents a dense, viscous gold. The true Steiner formula catalyst. The security chief, arriving moments later, stared from the shattered window to the recovered catalyst, to the calm janitor. The 3 immobilized, burning Panzer hulks were visible on the perimeter road. The official report would be complex, classified, and sanitized. German ground assault neutralized by quick-thinking security forces utilizing experimental high-explosive charges. But the truth was a simple, quiet man with a crazy mop handle. Elias Vance was debriefed, praised, and then quietly asked to return to his duties. He didn't want a medal. He wanted his order back. The next morning, the floors of the Fort Blackwood Annex were again spotless. The loose floor tile was fixed. Dr. Steiner was gone. The only visible change was a faint, blue electrical burn mark on the handle of the Sentinel. Elias pushed his cart, the weight of the aluminum staff comforting in his hands. He was still the janitor, but he had grown into something more profound. He had saved the annex, not with a weapon of war, but with the quiet courage of a man who saw what others missed, and the power of a tool that others ridiculed. The janitor, once overlooked, was now the unseen guardian of the home front. His war was not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the corridors of a secret lab. And, for Elias Vance, the maintenance of order was the highest form of heroism. If you were captivated by Elias's journey from invisible janitor to national hero, hit that like button. This is the kind of thrilling, realistic story that proves true heroes can be found where you least expect them. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with a friend. Your support helps us tell more incredible, untold stories from the shadows of World War II.